On a stormy night in 1987, a brilliant scientist stepped into his private laboratory and was never seen again. What happened inside those locked walls has puzzled investigators, locals, and curious minds for decades. Tonight, we'll take you deep into the mystery, piece by piece, until you're left with only one chilling question that refuses to let go. Stay with me until the very end, because this story holds something you won't forget. The year was 1987, and in a quiet town that most people would drive through without notice, there stood an old building with tall iron gates and windows that never seemed to glow with light except in the late hours of night. This was where Dr. Adrian Kessler worked, a man spoken about with admiration and unease in equal measure. He was not the kind of scientist who spent his days in lecture halls or government labs. He preferred solitude, long hours, and the freedom to pursue ideas without interference. People whispered about the things he was building, about discoveries that were never meant to be public, about theories that bent the rules of reality itself. He never confirmed or denied these whispers, but he carried an air that suggested he knew something the rest of the world had not yet caught up to. That September night, rain pounded the streets in heavy sheets, washing the town in silver reflections. The sky cracked with thunder, and the air carried a heavy stillness between storms, as though waiting for something unseen. Neighbors who lived near the old building would later recall a single light burning in the top window of the lab, glowing faintly behind rain-streaked glass. They would remember the shadow of a man moving back and forth, restless, focused, consumed by something only he could see. They would also remember that after midnight, that light flickered once, then vanished forever. Dr. Kessler had entered his laboratory that evening with more energy than usual. His notes, scattered across his desk, bore equations and diagrams so complex that even seasoned scientists would struggle to recognize their patterns. He had been working on something he never shared with colleagues, something he called in private letters the threshold experiment. The last entry in his journal, smudged by the damp air, spoke of reaching a point where mathematics no longer behaved like numbers on a page, but like doors waiting to be opened. He believed he was closer than he had ever been, to proving that unseen dimensions were not just theory, but something that could be touched, felt, even crossed. The storm outside only seemed to fuel his concentration. He had always worked best under pressure, and the rumble of thunder was like a drumbeat to his thoughts. He set up his instruments carefully, checking connections, measuring currents, adjusting fragile wires with steady hands. His desk was a chaos of scribbled notes, open books, and crumpled pages, yet in his mind everything was in perfect order. He leaned over the final equation, writing in quick, sharp strokes, his handwriting breaking down into half-legible symbols as if the math itself was pulling away from human language. At exactly midnight, the old clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, its echo bouncing through the silent room. Adrian did not notice it at first. He was lost in the rhythm of his calculations, the numbers and shapes circling in his mind. The machine he had built, an odd assembly of coils, glass tubes, and humming circuits, began to vibrate softly. Blue sparks danced across its surface, faint but growing. He adjusted the controls, murmuring to himself words no one else would understand. Then, for a brief moment, his face softened. He sat back, staring at the chalkboard where the equation had stopped midline. His pen rested against the page, as though he hesitated, as though finishing that last symbol would change more than just the ink on paper. What happened next has never been fully explained. Witnesses later reported a strange sound rolling through the street. Not thunder, not wind, but something that seemed to hum beneath their skin. Some described it as a deep vibration, others as a low metallic groan, like steel bending under impossible weight. Inside the lab, the air thickened. Papers lifted off the desk, as though the room had lost its gravity. A faint glow spread from the machine, swallowing shadows in unnatural light. And then silence. When the building was entered the following morning, the door was still locked from the inside. There were no signs of break-in, no shattered glass, no struggle. The lab was in disarray, but not in the way a fight would leave it. The desk was scattered with notes, many of them unreadable, smudged by water that had leaked through the cracked ceiling. The chalkboard bore the half-finished equation, the line ending abruptly as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. On the floor, one shoe lay overturned near the machine, its leather scuffed as though dragged. But Adrian Kessler himself was gone. Police searched for days, combing the woods, the rivers, even abandoned wells in the countryside. There was no body, no trace. The machine, though still standing, had burned out from within, its glass tubes shattered inward rather than outward, as if something had collapsed instead of exploded. Investigators could not explain the burn patterns on the floor, strange circular marks that looked almost like overlapping rings. No report could describe what force could have caused them. The case quickly turned from active search to whispered rumor. Some said he had gone mad and staged his own disappearance. Others believed he had been taken by those who wanted his work silenced. But those who knew him best, though few in number, were certain he had not left by choice. They spoke of his obsession, of how he believed he was standing on the edge of something no one else dared approach. And if he had crossed that edge, then perhaps he had not vanished into the world they knew, but into something else entirely. For decades, the lab remained sealed, its windows boarded, its halls collecting dust. Children dared each other to peer through the cracks, claiming they saw shadows moving inside, even when the sun was out. Researchers occasionally tried to gain access, but the property was tied up in legal disputes, locked away like a memory the town wanted to forget. Still, some could not let go. A few quiet voices kept returning to the mystery, digging through his notes, searching for the missing pieces. They found letters written to a distant colleague, filled with riddles disguised as scientific thought. They found a single reel of audio tape, its recording warped but clear enough to capture Adrian's voice, trembling with both fear and excitement as he whispered, "I think I've found the way." But the most haunting discovery came from those scattered notes left on his desk. Among the chaos of symbols and lines, one half-finished equation stood out. No one had ever solved it, not fully. Every attempt to complete it ended in contradictions, patterns breaking apart into impossibilities. Mathematicians who examined it claimed it was unlike anything they had ever seen, as though it was written in the language of something that did not belong to this world. And so the story of Adrian Kessler became one of those mysteries told in hushed voices, the kind of tale passed down through generations, always with a shiver, always with a pause at the end. What did he discover that night? What had taken him from that locked room, leaving behind only a shoe, a broken machine, and a line of numbers that refused to be solved? No one could say for certain. But sometimes, when storms rolled through town, locals swore the old building lit up for a second, a pale flicker in its upper window, like a lamp burning in a room that no longer had an owner. And in those fleeting moments, some claimed they could hear a faint hum in the air, a sound that didn't belong to thunder or rain, a sound that made the skin crawl as though the world was about to open. The truth, hidden beneath decades of silence, had not gone anywhere. It waited, patient, deep in the heart of unanswered questions. And those who dared to look closer always found themselves staring at the same unfinished line, the same half-written equation, wondering if finishing it would reveal the answer, or repeat the fate of the man who once dared to write it. Years passed after the night Dr. Adrian Kessler disappeared, but the mystery did not fade the way unsolved cases usually did. It lingered, heavy and restless, like a storm cloud refusing to drift away. His disappearance had been sealed in police files, but the rumors it left behind spread far wider than paper could contain. People spoke of it in taverns late at night, of the man who had been too smart for his own good, the scientist who had found a door no one else could see. In 1995, almost 8 years after the event, a young physics student named Daniel Mercer stumbled upon the story by accident. He had been combing through old academic papers in the dusty basement of his university library when he found an article clipped from a regional journal. The headline was simple, almost too quiet for the story it carried. Local scientist vanishes during storm. Daniel read it once, then twice, unsettled by the brief description of the locked room mystery and the mention of a half-finished equation. Something in that detail caught him, as though those numbers had been waiting for someone to find them. Daniel was not extraordinary by reputation, not yet. But he carried an obsession with patterns that few could match. Where others saw equations as walls of symbols, Daniel saw them as maps, roads, living things with directions. He became consumed by the thought of that equation, incomplete, yet still surviving in police files or perhaps hidden in the old laboratory. The idea that a formula could remain unsolved for decades tugged at him, kept him awake at night. Equations always had answers, he thought, unless the answer was not meant to be found. His first step was to travel to the town where Kessler had lived. It was a gray, quiet place by the late 90s, its factories closing, its streets half empty. The laboratory stood at the end of a narrow lane, surrounded by rusting iron gates. The building was boarded up, yet its presence dominated the neighborhood like a shadow that never moved. Daniel asked around, but most locals were reluctant to talk. Some shrugged, saying they had forgotten. Others crossed themselves and muttered that it was better to leave the past where it was. But there was one man who spoke. An elderly watchmaker who had lived across the street his entire life told Daniel about that night in 1987. His voice trembled as he recalled how the sky had lit up, how the sound had shaken his bones. He swore he had seen the upper window glowing with a strange white light, brighter than any lamp, then vanishing all at once. When Daniel asked if he had seen anyone leave, the old man only shook his head and whispered, "No one came out." That's the worst part. He was gone before the light went out. Daniel managed to find the old police records, brittle and yellowed, kept in boxes at the town hall. He pored over them until his eyes blurred. The crime scene sketches were detailed, the desk with its scattered notes, the machine half destroyed, the single shoe on the floor. And then, at the bottom of the file, a folded sheet of paper. It was a copy of the unfinished equation. Daniel's heart raced as he unfolded it, staring at the patterns that twisted across the page. The equation was not ordinary. It spiraled, broke rules, merged numbers and symbols in ways that should not have been possible. Daniel felt both awe and dread as he studied it. There was a rhythm in it, like a pulse, something alive. He tried to trace its path with his finger, but his mind stumbled as though the numbers resisted being followed. He copied it down carefully, determined to take it back with him for further study. From that night on, Daniel could not stop. He filled notebooks with attempts to finish what Kessler had started. Every time he thought he was close, the numbers fell apart, collapsing into contradictions. It was as though the equation led him to a cliff edge and dared him to step off. Some nights, he swore he heard a faint hum when he worked too long, a sound deep in the air of his dorm room, a sound that stopped the moment he looked up. One evening, as rain lashed against his window, he dreamed of the laboratory. He saw the scattered papers, the broken machine, the flicker of light in the upper window. And in the dream, Dr. Kessler stood by the chalkboard, half-turned, his face blurred by shadow. Kessler lifted the chalk, drew the unfinished line, then turned his head toward Daniel as though he knew he was watching. His lips moved, but no sound came. Daniel woke with a jolt, his chest pounding, his ears ringing with the same low hum. The dream unsettled him, but it also pulled him deeper. He began to wonder if the equation was more than just numbers. What if it was a kind of map, a design not for a machine, but for a doorway? He returned to the laboratory, breaking past the rotting boards and dust to explore what remained. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been, as if the building itself remembered the night it had lost its master. Dust coated the floors, but the circular burn marks were still visible, faint but unmistakable. Standing over them, Daniel felt dizzy, his vision bending at the edges as though the circles themselves carried weight. In the back corner, hidden behind a collapsed shelf, Daniel found something extraordinary. A box of tapes, labeled only with numbers and dates. He took them home, borrowed an old recorder, and began to listen. Most were filled with quiet static, but a few carried Kessler's voice. His tone was urgent, whispering as though afraid someone might hear. He spoke of thresholds, of boundaries thinner than air, of vibrations that resonated with more than just sound. "The equation is not mine," Kessler whispered in one recording. "It feels given, as though I only uncovered what was already there. But finishing it may mean I do not return." The more Daniel listened, the more the voice of the vanished scientist haunted him. He began to live as Kessler had lived, working late into the night, scribbling equations until his hands cramped. His friends noticed the change, but when they asked, he brushed them off. He could not explain the pull, the way the numbers seemed alive. Then came a night when Daniel finally wrote the last symbol. He did not mean to, but his hand moved as though guided, completing the line where Kessler had stopped. The moment the chalk touched the end, his dorm room lights flickered. A vibration spread through the air, so faint at first that he thought it was his imagination. But it grew, humming in his bones, making his teeth ache. Papers lifted off his desk, floating for a moment before settling back down. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Daniel sat frozen, his heart racing. He looked down at the completed equation, but the moment he stared at it, the symbols seemed to blur, shifting on the page until he could no longer recognize them. He tore the sheet out, stuffed it in a drawer, and tried to sleep. But sleep did not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the circular marks on the lab floor, the glow of the machine, the blurred face of Adrian Kessler whispering words he could not hear. The next day, he returned to the laboratory once more. The storm clouds had rolled in, thick and heavy, mirroring the night Kessler had vanished. Inside the dusty room, Daniel placed his notebook on the desk, right where Kessler's notes had once rested. He whispered to himself, repeating the numbers under his breath, testing the rhythm of the equation. And then, for the first time, he heard it clearly, the same sound described by witnesses in 1987, a low metallic groan vibrating through the air. He froze. The boards on the window rattled, the dust shifted across the floor, and the faintest glow appeared in the circles burned into the wood. He staggered back, his breath caught in his chest. The light flickered once, twice, then vanished, leaving only silence. Daniel left the lab that night, shaken to his core. He knew now that the mystery of Adrian Kessler was not a simple disappearance. Something had happened in that room, something that left marks not just on wood and paper, but on the very air itself. The equation was not an unfinished thought. It was a key, and both he and Kessler had turned it. But the door it unlocked was not meant to be opened. And Daniel, though he did not yet realize it, had already stepped too close to the threshold himself. The weeks after Daniel's encounter in the abandoned laboratory slipped by in a haze of unease. His friends noticed how pale he had grown, how he startled at small sounds, how his eyes seemed to linger on spaces where nothing stood. He gave excuses, said he was tired, buried in research, but deep inside he knew something had shifted. The moment the glow had shimmered in those burn marks, the line between his own life and Adrian Kessler's had blurred. He could feel it in the way the silence of his room no longer felt empty, in the way his dreams pulled him to the same place again and again. At night, the hum returned. It came softly at first, so faint he thought it was the wind in the vents. But then it grew, vibrating low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from within his own chest. Each time it happened, the completed equation burned in his mind, demanding his attention. He would see flashes, circles overlapping, faint lines that stretched into infinity, glimpses of light bending at impossible angles. Sometimes he thought he saw figures in those glimpses, shadows caught between the folds of vision, waiting. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Daniel returned to the tapes he had found in the laboratory. His hands trembled as he threaded the next reel into the recorder. The static cleared, and Kessler's voice rose once more. This time it was weaker, slower, but filled with awe. "I have crossed it," Kessler whispered, his breath ragged. For a moment, only a moment, the air bent, and I was not here, not there, but somewhere in between. It is not a place I can describe. Shapes, movement without motion, sound without air. but there was presence. I was not alone. Something waits beyond, watching, as though I have intruded on their silence. If I go again, I fear I will not return. Yet how can I resist? How can anyone resist the proof of what lies beyond our reach? Daniel stopped the tape, his pulse racing. The words settled deep into him, confirming what he had feared. Kessler had not vanished by accident. He had stepped through, guided by the very equation Daniel had now completed. But where had he gone? And what was the presence he spoke of? The next days were restless. Daniel skipped classes, choosing instead to wander the town, circling the laboratory like a moth unable to resist the glow of a flame. He studied every corner of the property, every crack in the walls, every faint mark left behind. He traced the circles on the floor with his fingers, his skin tingling as though the wood held a memory. He even began recording himself, speaking into an old tape recorder late at night, just as Kessler had done, whispering his thoughts so he could listen later for what he might have missed. And then the dreams changed. They were no longer silent visions of Kessler standing at the chalkboard. Now, Daniel dreamed of corridors that stretched endlessly, their walls pulsing faintly like the inside of a living thing. The hum was always there, a steady pulse guiding him forward. Sometimes he would glimpse movement in the distance, shapes slipping behind corners, figures vanishing the moment he tried to focus. He would wake drenched in sweat, his ears ringing with the echo of that hum. One morning, as dawn crept across the town, Daniel awoke to find something strange on his desk. His notebook lay open, pages covered in fresh markings he did not remember writing. The handwriting was his, but the symbols twisted and curved in ways he had never seen before. It was as though the equation had begun to rewrite itself, extending beyond the limits of the page. Panic surged through him, but beneath it was something worse, an exhilaration he could not deny. The numbers were leading him again, pushing him closer. He began to fear sleep, but he could not resist it. Each dream felt less like imagination and more like memory. He could feel the floor of that endless corridor beneath his feet, smell the metallic tang of the air, hear whispers brushing against his ears though he could not make out the words. He started to leave a lamp on at night, but the light did nothing to chase away the visions. The presence was there whether his eyes were open or closed. One rainy evening, Daniel sat by the boarded window of the laboratory, listening to the storm. He pressed his palm against the damp wood, and for a moment he swore he felt a vibration beneath it, like a heartbeat. He whispered, "Adrian, where are you?" The words left his lips before he realized what he had said. To his horror, something answered, not with words, not with sound, but with pressure, as if the air itself pushed against him in acknowledgement. He stumbled back, breathless, his skin prickling. He fled the building that night. Yet even as he ran through the rain, he could not shake the sense that something had followed him. The following weeks blurred. Daniel spoke less to his friends, spending more time alone. His eyes were shadowed, his skin pale. He carried the notebook with him everywhere, clutching it as though it were both burden and anchor. Sometimes he would stop mid-step on the street, staring at nothing, listening to a sound no one else could hear. Finally, in desperation, he sought out the watchmaker again, the old man who had seen the light in 1987. They sat together in the dim shop, the smell of oil and dust heavy in the air. Daniel told him of the dreams, the sounds, the equation. The old man listened in silence, his face drawn tight. When Daniel finished, the watchmaker leaned forward and whispered, "Then you have gone too far. You must stop now. Do you understand? This is not a puzzle to solve. It is a wound, and the more you press, the wider it opens." Daniel asked what he had seen that night, truly seen beyond the light. The old man hesitated, then said, "It wasn't just light. It was like the world folded. For a second, I saw something through the window. Not him, something else. And when the light vanished, so did he." His voice trembled. "I never told the police that. I never told anyone. But if you're following his path, you will end the same way. Don't go back there. Burn those papers. Forget it." But Daniel could not forget. The warning only deepened his need to know. The next night, He returned once more to the laboratory. The storm had risen again, the sky alive with thunder. Inside, the air was heavy, pressing against his skin. He laid the notebook on the desk and stared at the circles on the floor. For the first time, he noticed that the marks seemed deeper than before, as though they had not merely burned into the wood, but sunk below it. His breath caught. He thought he saw movement in the faint glow, as though the circles still lived, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the hum in his chest. He pressed his hand against them, and the room shifted. The walls seemed to tilt, the air thickened, and a pressure filled his ears until he could hear nothing but the deep, metallic groan. Papers flew into the air, spinning around him. The light flickered once, twice, then burst into brightness. Daniel stumbled back, shielding his eyes, but in that glow he saw something. Not a man, not Kessler, but a shape, blurred, stretched, shifting like liquid shadow. It did not move toward him, yet he felt its attention lock on him, heavy and unyielding. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his bones until he thought he would collapse. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. He was alone again, the room silent but for the rain outside. The circles were dark once more, the air still. But Daniel knew what he had seen. Something had been waiting just beyond the threshold. Something that had seen him and now could not unsee him. He fled the laboratory that night, but he could not flee the truth. Adrian Kessler had not vanished into nothing. He had crossed into whatever lay beyond those circles, into that place of corridors and whispers. And now, Daniel was being drawn there too, whether he wanted it or not. In the silence of his dorm room, he played back the tape of his own recordings. His voice trembled, whispering about the dreams, the hum, the light. But then, to his horror, he heard something else in the background. Faint, almost buried beneath the static. A second voice, low and distorted, repeating his words a fraction of a second after he spoke them. It was not his echo, and when he replayed the tape again, straining to hear, he realized the voice was not only repeating, it was answering. Daniel listened to the tape again and again, each time certain his mind was playing tricks on him, but the voice was there. Low, distorted, impossible to place, but undeniably present. It lingered just behind his own, weaving through his words like a shadow slipping between beams of light. The longer he listened, the more it felt deliberate, as if the voice was not merely repeating but communicating. Some phrases twisted slightly, carrying tones that rose where his had fallen, forming answers he could almost understand but not quite grasp. The discovery unsettled him in ways he could not name. He stopped eating well, stopped sleeping entirely some nights. When exhaustion finally dragged him into unconsciousness, he awoke with the sheets damp from sweat and the hum still echoing in his bones. His dreams grew stranger, no longer confined to corridors, but now opening into vast spaces where the sky folded in on itself, where light bent in directions that defied the eye. There were shapes there, vast and silent, moving slowly across impossible landscapes. And always at the edges of the dream, he felt a presence watching him, patient and unblinking. One afternoon, after a sleepless night, Daniel carried the notebook into the library. He hoped surrounding himself with ordinary life, books, students, the quiet scratch of pens on paper, might ground him. Instead, as he laid the notebook open, the symbols seemed to shift before his eyes, rearranging themselves in ways he hadn't written. He blinked hard, rubbed his face, but when he looked again, the lines were still altered, pointing toward patterns he could not comprehend. He slammed the book shut, drawing uneasy stares from nearby students. His hand shook. The equation was no longer fixed. It was alive, rewriting itself, and he could no longer tell whether he was its author or its servant. That night, he placed the notebook inside a locked drawer and swore not to touch it again. But the hum returned almost immediately, louder than ever, rising through the walls, rattling the glass on his desk. The lamp flickered in shadows on the wall, stretched unnaturally long, bending away from their sources. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound was not in the air. It was inside him. His heartbeat began to sync with it, thudding in rhythm with the vibration until he could not tell where his body ended and the sound began. He yanked the drawer open, pulled the notebook free, and the moment he touched it, the sound softened. His heart slowed, the room steadied. His hands trembled as he realized what had happened. It wanted him to continue. And by holding back, he had provoked it. The next days blurred. He wrote compulsively, filling page after page with symbols he barely understood. Sometimes he would come to himself hours later, staring at lines he had no memory of inscribing. The equation stretched further, growing more elaborate, spiraling into diagrams that looked like maps, blueprints, or perhaps something in between. He began to recognize structures within them, shapes that mirrored the overlapping circles burned into the laboratory floor, lines that curved toward impossible vanishing points. He could not explain why, but deep down he knew he was building something. Not a machine, not in the ordinary sense, but a pathway. As his obsession grew, his world narrowed. He stopped answering calls from his family. He withdrew from his classes. Professors left messages, concerned, but he ignored them. Food sat untouched on his desk until it rotted, ignored beside the ever-expanding sea of notes. His only companion was the voice, faint on his recordings, sometimes louder when he was half asleep. It whispered syllables he could almost understand, words that felt ancient, heavy, carrying weight beyond meaning. He began to respond without realizing it, whispering back into the darkness of his room, asking questions, begging for clarity. And once, only once, he received an answer he could not deny. The tape played back his own voice, ragged and hoarse, asking, "What do you want from me?" For a moment, there was only static. Then, layered beneath it, the second voice rose clear and sharp for the first time. "To finish." Daniel froze, staring at the recorder as the word echoed in the silence. He rewound it, played it again, over and over until he was certain he had not imagined it. The voice had spoken, and it had told him exactly what he already feared. He was continuing the work Adrian Kessler had started. Driven by both dread and compulsion, Daniel returned to the laboratory more frequently. He would sit in the cold silence of the boarded room, laying his pages across the dust-coated desk. Each time he traced the symbols aloud, the air grew heavy, the circles on the floor glimmered faintly, and the hum swelled until the boards rattled in their frames. Once, he swore he saw a light leak through the cracks of the walls, faint but undeniable, like the glow of a storm contained just beyond the building itself. The watchmaker noticed. One evening he found Daniel standing outside the gates in the rain, staring at the upper windows. The old man approached slowly, his lantern casting long shadows. "You've been inside again," he said softly, not a question, but a truth. Daniel did not deny it. "You don't understand," Daniel whispered. "The equation isn't broken. It isn't unfinished. It's leading somewhere." He didn't vanish. He crossed over. "I've seen it." The watchmaker gripped his arm, his eyes sharp. "And you will vanish too if you don't stop. You think knowledge is always a gift, but sometimes it's a snare. Adrian wasn't the first man to chase what isn't meant for us, but he may be the first who succeeded. That doesn't make him lucky." Daniel pulled free, anger flaring despite the fear gnawing at him. If there's a place beyond this, if he reached it, then he didn't fail. He discovered the greatest truth there is. The old man shook his head, voice trembling. And if that truth is emptiness, or worse, if it is not empty at all? He turned away, his shoulders heavy. "You're not chasing him. You're being pulled where he went. That's the difference." Daniel stood in the rain long after the lantern's glow faded. The words haunted him, yet they did nothing to loosen the grip the equation held. He felt it every hour of every day, pressing him forward. He no longer believed he had a choice. It was late one night, when thunder rolled and lightning slashed across the horizon, that Daniel finally felt the equation had reached its end. The pages sprawled across his desk seemed to converge, lines and circles aligning with a clarity he had never seen before. He realized with a shock that he had recreated, almost perfectly, the machine Kessler had once built, but in diagrams alone. The coils, the glass, the overlapping rings, they were all there, written in the silent language of numbers. And at the bottom of the final page, his own hand had scrawled a phrase he did not remember writing. "It is open." He stared at the words, his skin crawling. He whispered them aloud, and as he did, the room grew colder. The lamp flickered, then burst with a pop, leaving him in darkness. Yet the notebook glowed faintly, the ink shimmering with light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He staggered back, his breath ragged, but he could not look away. That night he dreamed of Adrian Kessler, not as a shadow, but as a figure standing in the endless corridor. His face was clearer now, lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with feverish light. He raised his hand as though beckoning Daniel forward. Behind him, the corridor split open into something vast, something that seemed to stretch beyond sight, filled with shifting shadows. Daniel tried to speak, but no words came. And then Kessler whispered, not in the dream, but directly into Daniel's ear, as though he stood beside him in the waking world. "It doesn't close." Daniel woke, gasping, his chest tight, his ears filled with a low hum. The notebook lay open on his desk, though he had closed it before sleeping. The pages had turned themselves, revealing new lines of symbols written in his own hand. He could not recall writing them, yet he recognized them instantly. They were instructions to build. From that night on, Daniel began collecting materials. Wires, coils, fragments of glass, scraps from electronics he salvaged from junk shops. He worked in secret, piecing together the machine Kessler had left behind. The closer it came to completion, the louder the hum grew, following him wherever he went. He knew what he was doing was dangerous, perhaps even madness, but he could no longer imagine stopping. And always, in the quietest hours, when the rain tapped against the windows and the air grew too still, he swore he heard footsteps that were not his own. Light, careful, pacing the edges of his room. He never turned fast enough to see, but he knew he was not alone. He was walking the same path Adrian Kessler had walked. And just as surely, he felt the same fate drawing near.